Hair curly, forehead shiny, audio kind of off-synced. What more could you want? Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and also a happy new year. I spent the last few weeks kind of going into social media retreat. Not really, I still was kind of checking the tabs, but I wasn't like actively putting out content anymore because I wanted to take a bit of a content break during the 12 nights of Christmas, and also producing content about your craft while still practicing your craft can sometimes be kind of complicated, because in the back of your mind you always have the thought of, oh, maybe I should film this, maybe I should document this, and I just needed a break from that and have more like me time basically. So apologies for letting you guys wait a little bit, but I already have a lot of amazing stuff planned for 2023 and I hope you're along for the ride with me. Now for this first video I was kind of inspired by a video the Witch of Wanderlust Semi recently did, where she went through her witchy bookshelf and kind of explained what she got, what she liked, what she didn't like, how she organized her books and stuff like that, and I really wanted to do this too, so this is what this video is, as you've probably figured by the title. So without further ado, let's start with the bookshelf right above me that you always see in my videos. These are actually two bookshelves on top of each other and I have them organized in two different ways. The bookshelf on the top is about Germanic paganism and heathenry, and the bookshelf at the bottom is about German folk magic. I consider myself to be a German folk magic practitioner first and foremost, but I think it's also important to kind of be informed on the pagan past, because that influences German folk magic. So on the top shelf on the left I have all of my primary resources on Germanic paganism, and I consider primary resources to be sort of first-hand accounts of Germanic paganism, or at least semi-first-hand accounts, like things that were produced in the past reasonably close to when Germanic paganism was practiced, and things which are studied today to gain more information and knowledge about Germanic paganism. That would include the Indiculus, which is a manuscript written by Christian missionaries which were trying to convert the pagan tribe of the Saxons to Christianity. And I don't know if I already talked about this, but here in northern Germany, the main Germanic tribe pre-Christianity was the tribe of the Saxons, and the minority language that I speak, Low Saxon, is also a direct evolution of the language that the tribe of the Saxons spoke. So I live on Saxon land, speak the Saxon language, and I'm kind of also immersed in what Saxon culture is today, although I would use that term very carefully. So I'm very interested in what their practices were like, and unfortunately they did not write anything down really. So these Christian missionary accounts are sort of one of the only few sources we have on this topic. Now, I don't know necessarily if I would consider this a primary source first and foremost, because the entire Indiculus is covered in here, yes, but it is also covered through the perspective of an academic lens, so it is also being talked about in here. So this is not just the pure Indiculus, but still interesting. Secondly, we have this really old book, Die schönsten deutschen Volks und Heldensagen. I don't think they produce this anymore, but basically this book includes the Nibelungenlied and a bunch of German mythological tales. If you've read the Norse Edda, you will also recognize a lot of these stories in here. Wayland the Smith is also in here, and a bunch of other interesting stuff, and if you are looking for more continental Germanic paganism, this is a really good resource in my opinion. Not this book itself, but more the stories that are within it. This is just more of a compilation of all of these stories, but today I think you will mostly find them all individually. Speaking of which, I have of course the Edda. This is the English version of the Poetic Edda, translated by Jackson Crawford. He also has a really good YouTube channel, I'll link that down below. And he took up the task of retranslating the Poetic Edda, which is interesting because most often people will not work with the original Edda text, but just pick up already translated bits and kind of reinterpret them, but he worked with the original text that can be found and retranslated it in what he thought would be more of an accurate translation. So it's mostly still the same, but it's very valuable and really interesting. And in this book, this is in German, is both the Poetic and prose Edda translated into German. And what I like about this book is that it also has notes at the side, kind of going a bit more in depth and explaining the things which are talked about in these stories here. What I don't necessarily like about this book is that the author tried to kind of keep up the rhythmic structure of the poems in the original Edda here and translate them into modern day High German, which doesn't necessarily work pretty well. This book, which doesn't do that, is, I think, more easy to read. Also, another really important book, if you are going down the more continental Germanic pagan path, would be the 𝔇𝔢, which is a book written by the Roman historian Tacitus, and he was a contemporary of the Germanic pagan tribes. He never visited Germania, though, or the region which the Romans called Germania, the region which was east of the Rhine and north of the empire. Of course, it's not going to be 100% accurate, and especially since he was a high-standing Roman citizen, his account is going to be pretty biased towards the Romans, and this book should also be viewed in its historical context. So read this with a huge mountain of salt, basically. And the last primary resource which I'm going to be talking about is Beowulf, of course. This is pretty straightforward. This book has just the story of Beowulf in it, old, probably pagan Germanic tale which got then sort of Christianized while keeping a lot of pagan elements. And yeah, also I think like Germanic medieval literature is kind of really cool to read. It has this unique vibe to it, which I really like. Another German book, Die Germanen. This book is not very thick, but it comes with a lot of pictures, pretty small text, so you can find a lot of information on here. This book is more or less about the Great Migration period and how that affected the Germanic tribes. So it focuses more on how the Germanic tribes interacted with the Roman Empire and centers mostly around the Germanic tribes which later settled in the Roman Empire and how they assimilated or did not assimilate into the culture. It focuses less on the Germanic tribes which remained in originally Germanic territory, so the tribe of the Saxons isn't really covered in here, but more so the Goths and the Franks and groups like that. From an historical and archaeological perspective, this is still pretty interesting, but not necessarily in a reconstruction kind of perspective. But this also gives a really good overview over the material culture of the Germanic tribes, with lots of pictures, which I also really like. Another German book, Die kleine Germanenkunde, which is pretty basic in my opinion. You can find all of this information for free on the internet if you go down just a big Wikipedia rabbit hole, but it's also nice to kind of have this information condensed and more pleasantly presented. But this book is kind of a meh for me. What isn't a meh for me, however, is this book, The Nordic Animist Year, and I recommend this for everyone who wants to go down either a Germanic pagan route or a folk magic route with folk magic from a Germanic country. I could go on and on about this book for ages, how it kind of centers rejected animist knowledge, which is often overlooked in contemporary discussion of Germanic paganism, and how it also talks about how sort of animist tradition kind of survived and reintegrated into the new Christian reality when that happened, and kind of how it transformed and changed with the people over time. So this is a really valuable resource and I highly recommend it. And last of the secondary resources is this book, Die Religion der Germanen, which is basically a giant essay on what we actually know about pre-Christian Germanic religion, which is not a whole lot actually. This book is from 2003, so a few things aren't accurate anymore with the new information that we have, but this is still a pretty valuable read. And now we get to the good part, now we get to the folk magic. So these books right here are all books in Low Saxon. They're not in the Low Saxon dialect which I speak, they are from the dialect which is spoken south of my region. They are in the Münsterland dialect of Low Saxon. And the funny thing is, I actually got them from the Netherlands. There was someone I found on Twitter who works with sort of old antiques from the Netherlands, and he had these books in his collection which come from a Dutch library, which you can also like see on the tags here. And he had just a bunch of them in the Münsterländic dialect and asked on Twitter if anyone wanted them for free. I said, yes, I would absolutely like to have them. I'm going to pay for the shipping. Yeah, so I got them. They are all, I think, over 100 years old. Yeah, so for example, this book is from 1918. It's all written in like old German font called Fraktur. I don't know if this focuses properly, but you can probably tell that these aren't your regular standard letters. It's a bit of a hassle reading Low Saxon in Fraktur, but you get kind of used to it after a while. I absolutely love these books and love to have them in my collection. And you might be wondering, what do these books have to do with German folk magic? And to that I could just reiterate, folk magic is about the folk, the people, and the language that the people speak, especially if it's a minority language, is so important in this concept. Spells, rituals, mindsets, philosophies are all going to be better depicted in the native language of the people whose folk magic you're going to try to learn. And you'll also more easily find information on folk magic in the native language of those people, which is exactly why I have these books. So next up, these books right here are more about the folklore from my region, and I kind of sorted them from closest to me to least closest to me. So for your information, I live in the northwest of Germany, and I live like right at the edge between the region of Westphalia and the state of Lower Saxony, which is why I kind of focus like on both regions. And I have both modern books on folklore as well as more older accounts. So for example, of an older account, this would be this book. I think it's from like the 60s or something. You can smell that as well. And then this book is more modern. And also note that I always kind of mark down important parts so I can easily find information that is interesting to my practice again. Another interesting find is right here. I found this in my regional capital, and this is a copy of, I think it's a 16th century manuscript written by Johann Wehr, and he was like a really important figure in the occult space for his time. And it's also believed that the Key of Solomon, which is one of the most important historical writings for Western occultism, is based on his writings. Not these writings though, these are just basically herbal remedies for certain diseases. This text is hundreds of years old, so it's not really easy to read everything and understand it, but again, you kind of get used to the writing and it's absolutely worth it in my opinion. Also, you kind of get these like funny early modern depictions of whatever that is. I actually have no clue what this bug is supposed to be. He doesn't write it in his text, but look, it has a face. So moving on from weird face bugs, I have another book in Low Saxon. This is actually written in the dialect from my region, which I really like. A book on Spökenkickerei, which is the branch of German folk magic that I practice, which has also been really valuable to me, although the person that wrote this is not necessarily an expert in the study of this craft. He is more like someone who took a bunch of accounts of Spökenkickerei and compiled them in this book, which is still pretty valuable because there are not a lot of resources on this path, but I have since found better resources. And this book, which I'm currently reading, which is on Westphalian folk art. And it luckily also has a lot of pictures how this folk art kind of manifests in, for example, day-to-day objects like these wooden shoes, for example. And also don't confuse the historical region of Westphalia with the borders of the modern-day state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Two different things. Then I have this amazing essay on the witch trials in Germany as they specifically pertain to my region, which now come to think of it, I should probably reread this book because it was really, really good. I don't know how much you could get out of all of these things if you aren't exactly studying the same folk magic that I am. So I think you might also be only able to get this book in a small bookshop in the capital city of my region. So I don't know how helpful any of this is to you guys, but these are things that I really love and I'd like to share with you. Then we have a few grimoires pertaining to German folk magic, like The Long Lost Friend or The Egyptian Secrets, which of course, again, lots and lots of bookmarks. However, these days I mostly get my German folk magic grimoires on the internet as a PDF, but I've already made an entire video about this and I'll link that somewhere. Also, of course, Grimm's Märchen. Are you even a German folk magic practitioner if you don't have this? I'm not so sure. The last section you can kind of see right here is about Silesian folklore, specifically the folklore of the part of Silesia where my family is originally from, which would be the county of Glatz. So again, an older book with lots of bookmarks, of course, and a newer version. I could basically sum these books on our Silesian folklore up with death, 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 murder, death, ghosts, death. The Silesians are a pretty gloomy people, which I think is kind of understandable when looking at their history. I got this book which pertains to like all of Silesia, and it has a bunch of cultural information on them about their food, their folklore again, their traditional clothing, their architecture, their language, stuff like that. And then, which I also really like, is I found a dictionary with the dialect of Silesian, which my family spoke and still kind of speaks, at least some of them. This dialect is called Pawash, and it is more on the Germanic side of Silesian dialects. But it also has a lot of Slavic influences. And lastly, in the Silesian section is this book on the county of Glatz, which talks in depth about its history, its culture, and basically does what this book does, but more regionally specific. It's written by Alois Bernatsky, and I think he is also from that region. However, I have some critiques on this book because it sort of replicates, maybe subconsciously, some anti-Silesian sentiments with categorizing them as either German or Polish or Czech, which, I don't know, I kind of feel weird about, since this categorization of Silesians has led to so much pain and trauma. So I and a lot of other Silesians just prefer to be called Silesians first and foremost. But I'll probably make an entire video on Silesian folk magic and cultural nuances, but currently I'm still very much procrastinating on that. Okay, now we move on from these bookshelves to my less aesthetic bookshelves right over there. And this is where I keep more of my generally witchy books. So I have this German book on local herbs that can be found in Germany, which is not necessarily witchy, but it also has a lot of information on herbal remedies in it and how to properly store, dry, gather, and prepare herbs and how to identify them. And this sort of book with the local flora that you have around you is really helpful, I think, no matter what path in witchcraft you take. Then I have this book from my grandparents, which is mostly about crystals and kind of new agey. I personally don't work with crystals as much, but I think it's still kind of interesting to have and to kind of possess something where I can quickly look up the properties of specific crystals should I ever need to. Oh, I love this book. Queens of the Wild by Ronald Hutton. Technically, I could also sort this into the German folk magic category, although this book doesn't exclusively talk about that, it just mentions it on the side. Now, Ronald Hutton is a scholar, which I really like, and he writes in a very scholarly way, and his book pertains to female spirits as they show up in folklore, and if they are just pagan goddesses with a different name or if they are something else. And it kind of challenges a lot of like new agey thought processes, which can often lead into folkish directions. So this book is a really good antidote for that, in my opinion, and I recommend everyone who's into any branch of European folk magic to read this book. But for my German folk magic friends, he also mentions Frau Holle and Perchta in here and how kind of their folklore originates. So A+. Oh, I also really like this book. Holistic Tarot by Annabelle Wen. Over 1,000 pages. And this is like the lawnmower manual of tarot books. I do have my fair share of critiques of this though. She uses a slur for Romani people in here, and she also writes in a very gendered way, like unnecessarily gendered way. And some of her interpretations of the tarot can kind of be a bit more like conservative leaning, if that's the right word. Maybe I'll do a proper review on this one day. But for a noob in tarot, basically, this was really helpful. Because for myself, I need pretty clear directions on what to do and how to do it, and what if X, and if X then Y. And this book is basically that. It has lots and lots of notes in the back and pretty much answers every single question you could maybe have about the tarot. And you'll also have to know that this is not just a passive read it and be done kind of book. Like, you have to actively pay attention and work with this book. It's kind of a school book in that sense. Also, the author has a background in academia, which also explains kind of her writing style and why I probably like it so much. Okay, and pretty quickly, other great books that I really like from that shelf. The Magic of Birthdays. This is basically if you ever wanted to know more about your astrological sign and kind of how that incorporates itself in the larger astrological framework, this is the book for you. It's not a lot of pages, it's not very thick. I got through this in I think maybe 2 or 3 days, and this is a crash course in how to interpret your astrological natal chart. Okay, honoring your ancestors. I feel like everyone and their grandmother has already talked about this, so I won't go in depth here, but if you ever wanted to do ancestor work and don't know where to start, this book. Start with this book. Year of the Witch by Temperance Alden. Interesting way to reframe the Wheel of the Year. It kind of helped me get along in my practice, but I would say if you already work with your own Wheel of the Year, you don't need to buy this book. Also, some of the information on the Sabbaths that she collected in this book is inaccurate, so be mindful of that. Wicca by Harmony Nice. This was a pretty early book in my collection. Some inaccurate information in here on the runes, which I really dislike. Also inaccurate information on the Sabbaths, but if you lean more towards the Wicca side, and if you view spirituality more through like a self-help framework, this book will probably be really good for you. Psychic Witch, also a book which everyone has already talked about. Also more of a workbook than just a passive reading book. This book is about how to properly manifest and formulate your magic in your mind and how to kind of have stronger effects with it. If your mind is pretty unrestful, I don't know if I would recommend this. I had great trouble focusing on the exercises in here, but I can see myself going to this book time and time again, because a lot of the time other books will reference manifest this, imagine this, visualize this, and I often think to myself, but I don't know how, and this is basically a how-to of that. Of Blood and Bones by Kate Fowler, I think is how you pronounce her name. I've heard that some of the exercises in this book are appropriated from Hoodoo. I don't know how accurate that information is. I'll just pass it on to you. And I don't really focus on the exercises that she has in here, but if you ever wanted to work with the moon phases more intensely and don't lean really to the love and light side of things, this might be a book for you. Also, what I found really valuable is that she talks about how to properly source materials from, for example, dead animals, which is something that is, I think, rarely talked about in the spiritual community. So in that sense, it was kind of a breath of fresh air. So these were all the books that I'll share with you today. I hope you found this video interesting, and I hope you learned something on how a folk witch might structure their bookshelf. Thanks for spending a bit of your time with me, and I'll see you in the next video. Ladi wat goed går.